All right, we're live.
It is. It says is preparing. It's preparing to go live. That's what it told me.
Give it another minute.
Done. Redirecting to Facebook is what it says. Now, I believe we are good. Excelente. Well, with the magic of the internet, Jesse, we connect all the way over there on the East Coast, Columbia University. So here we are.
Yeah, hey y'all. Whether you're here with us in the classroom in Manhattan or somewhere out on the internet, my name is Jesse Thorson. I'm a junior in the liberal arts school here at Columbia studying sustainable development. And I'm an outreach team leader here with Columbia Faith in Action, a Christian ministry here on campus for undergrads. And we're really excited to introduce, for those of you in the room, up on the screen behind me from the other side of the country in Redondo Beach, California, author and theologian Tripp Fuller. Just want to say a couple words about who he is. He's the director of theology and humanities at Hatchery in LA, founder of the Homebrewed Theology, popular theology podcast and website, and he is currently finishing up a dissertation in philosophy, religion, and theology at Claremont Graduate University, and he is the author of the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus, Lord, Liar, Lunatic, or Awesome. And we're really pleased to have Tripp with us here to discuss his book, in which he examines and discusses the historical Jesus, the development of the doctrine of Christ, and the questions that drove the Christological innovations happening over the centuries and 2 millennia that the church has been around. So yeah, Tripp, thanks for being with us tonight. Would love for you to kind of tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe tell us your story and how you ended up writing this book.
So, I am from North Carolina. I'm not from Southern California naturally, though the past 8 years I've been here, and I have adjusted and become a wuss when I visit places that are cold, like where you are. I get out now and immediately look for heavy coats. But I grew up in North Carolina in the South. I was a church planter's kid, which meant that it wasn't hard to run into Jesus if your family starts churches. I was also, I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. I went to art magnet schools, which means that from middle school on, like half my day was doing theater and musical theater. I was a philosophy and musical theater major in undergrad. And this book about Jesus really comes out of going into college, starting to think for myself, think critically in new ways, and being just naturally a nerd. Like I was reading philosophy and stuff in middle school, but you know, if you go to an art school, you should you should just have a pipe and read dead people, even if you don't smoke, and even if you don't even understand what Kierkegaard's saying, you should just have existentialist literature around and walk around the pipe. Maybe have patches on your elbow. Who knows? That was what cool people did at art school where I was. So I pretended I knew what was going on, reading Sartre and Camus and Kierkegaard and stuff. And eventually, in undergrad, I took the classes to know what in the world they were talking about, and just kind of freaked out and thought, I don't know what's going on. And I got really into all the nerdy parts about the study of religion. How do you understand it as an anthropologist, sociologist? I got really into science and religion issues and all that kind of stuff. And this book is really kind of the product of me coming back around, you could say, to embracing my identity as a Christian or follower of Jesus or whatever. It has a kind of positive celebratory tone between inappropriate jokes for religious books and things, and it's there because honestly, when I went to college, and y'all are in Columbia, so I'm going to guess it's not the same as a Baptist school in the South, but you can imagine there was people like Jesse who were volunteers for outreach coordinators at groups there, and what they did is they went 2 by 2 to each dorm room Because when you're at a school with mandatory chapel, clearly what you need is two of your friends twice a month coming to your door to ask if have asked Jesus in your heart to avoid eternal conscious torment. That was what happened at this school. And if Jesus has like the worst public relations officers, I don't know how this goes, but so for me, this book is really coming back around to say, to talk about how I understand Jesus is historically, philosophically, where the history of the ideas that kind of developed through church history came from, and really it's an attack on the world's worst way to introduce people to Jesus, which is what I got door to door when I was in college. Of course, they go the philosophy majors, musical theater majors, double. So I was like the golden snitch, or the golden ticket of conversions. They were like, he's a preacher's kid and he's a philosophy and musical theater major. That means he has lots of gay and Jewish friends. So they would normally come, and you get this. It's like C.S. Lewis's worst idea, where what do you say of Jesus is the question, and they're like, here's a trick. He's either a liar because he said he was God, obviously. He's a lunatic. Do you want to offend me and call my man JC a lunatic right to my face? That'd be offensive. Your mom would cry. Or he's Lord. Those are your three options. It's a trilemma. And is it odd that Christian trilemma has three because of the Trinity? I don't know. Maybe. Who knows? Well, there's just some basic problems with that. There's like the nerdy problems that, even the conservative biblical scholars that aren't fundamentalists with charts about the end of the world and are Zionists, they all know that the historical Jesus didn't walk around saying he was God. And I'll talk about that in the book. Then there's like the other nerdy problems that trilemma is just poor philosophical logic, but we don't have to talk about that. The main thing is that was absolutely not how Jesus related to anybody. Like, he never walked around, and this is what that actually comes across as. I don't know. I've never felt to really pull this card on someone, but at least for me, a preacher's kid experienced it this way, where they walk in a room and be like, I'm here on your behalf, and God sent me, but I just wanted you to know that you suck. There's only one thing that really matters, because you're going to live forever. It's going to be in heaven or hell. And in order to get there, God sent Jesus as a homeless Jew in the first century in order for you to answer this multiple choice question correctly. And your three options are Lord, liar, and lunatic. And I really hope you pick Lord, because me and God love you. But, these are just the rules. We got to figure this out. Let me help you. I have some Bible verses to quote if that helps. But I don't know. We have a really cool event coming up this weekend. We're gonna play volleyball at the and then they tell you about what the events are going on and thing. And this was never Jesus's approach. In fact, if you read the New Testament, which I found people that believe the Bible do on occasion, not all the time, they like talking about it more. The identity of Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, was something that kind of got settled pretty early at the baptism, right? Then there's a dove. It's like, this is my son. You should listen to him. But the entire Gospels are stories where the disciples answer the question correctly and get it wrong, right? So Peter, the first person to say, you are the Christ, Son of the living God, the first pope. I mean, come on. And this is before popes had red shoes. He said, you're the Christ, Son of the living God. When Jesus asked him, who do you say I am? You're the Christ, Son of the living God. He gets it right. The next day or so, because we don't know, 3 chapters later, Jesus is like, it's time to go to Jerusalem. Peter says, hey, Jesus, if you keep talking junk about the temple and Rome and all the powers that be, and then you show up in town, they will kill you. This is a bad idea. And Peter is right. But Jesus goes, get behind me, Satan. Why? Not because Peter didn't know he was the Christ, Son of the living God, but because it's the human, natural move to take the truth and then project content into it that cooperates with empire and oppression, that cooperates with our own agenda as being on Team Jesus to not go to where you're going to be persecuted. Like, we naturally want to fill the content of truth. Jesus is Lord. with ideas that just happen to be what we want. And I think that is problematic, and that the response, as a contemporary response to Jesus, is not like a multiple choice question, but it's going on a journey where you are stuck asking questions the whole time. You have doubts, beliefs, and it's in community. And Jesus promises in the New Testament to be three places, none of which are a theology class or a church. He promises to be in relationships where you're able to be honest and forgive each other and reconcile. That's hard. So we don't have to focus on that right now. He promises to be in the other. Whenever you tend to the least of these, or supporting and advocating and connecting with the oppressed, those in prison, those in need, then you are connecting to Christ. And he promised to be at the table, the Eucharist, like communion. And I think, like, if I was thinking back to my time, I was a campus minister at UNC Greensboro when I was in divinity school. And it was there I learned that the table part is the most important part, I think, for campus ministry when you're in college. And here's why. The church has ruined the Eucharist, communion. How many of us, when we have it, it begins with at the end of a worship service, and we're already ready to leave. And then we're like, oh my God, are you really going to have this junk go over? Like, Homeboy had a long sermon. Soloist was totally into that. The prayer's long. We got 12 minutes towards we're peacing out. Could you hurry up? And then it happens in the same way. Sometimes you get Jesus chiclets, those little bread things. Sometimes you get a little grape juice. Sometimes you dip. There's all sorts of ways. But if we look at where Jesus promised to be, and we look at the Eucharist in the New Testament, he gave that meal at the end. It was not at the beginning, but it was at the end of a meal with friends. They had been drinking wine. Now, I've had many meals with a bunch of Jewish people. You don't end it with like you're on your first glass of wine. They've been rocking the wine with JC. They just had a giant celebratory meal. They're sitting there having food. They've like had physical material nourishment. And then he says, with full bellies, maybe a little tipsy because it's a religious celebration. He says, like, this is my body, this is my blood, do this in remembrance of me. And that condition of being with your best friends, the people you love and are serving with, and at the end of a celebratory meal saying, this is my body, this is my blood, and promising to be there. I think that is the place for people that are in this transition part of life, in college, figuring out your identity and vocation, trying to figure out building community. Like, it's a hobby in college to go advocate, right? Like, it is. We had die-ins. Like, we could get twice as many people to show up for the protest for something than to pray. And so, but the thing that is so hard is to have those relationships where you've connected and partied long enough that the basic mundane things, hanging with friends, having a big meal, talking it out, become sacred. And they become sacred because you've attended to the relationships, you've been able to be honest and bring yourself. And when Jesus is like, when you advocate for the other, when you reconcile, when you party, I will show up. To me, I remember I was 20 years old. It was the end of my junior year. My grandmother had just died of cancer in a very fast, ugly way. She had relapsed, and I was told, I got a call, said she's cancer-free, and once her white blood cells up, you can go see her. And so it was sleeting, like ice rain. We have that in the South. We don't get real snow. We get ice rain, which just ruins power and everything. So I didn't drive the hour and a half up to see her like I had done every week since she'd been in the hospital. And then that night, she got pneumonia and died. I remember that experience setting off me just thinking tons of crap that I've been told about God was just ridiculous. Oh, God has a plan. God was in charge. It's God's will. Like, no, you want to know, if God's at least as nice as Jesus, God wasn't sitting around going, here's a trick. So it's ice rain. It's unsafe to drive. Let's tell Tripp that his grandmother actually is cancer-free, against what anyone ever thought. so he doesn't drive in the ice rain like she would want, and then she dies at night. And I remember thinking that. And then if you're in the middle of, you just know Western history, there are a million worse things that have happened where you said, if it could have been different, and God wants to use the word love attached to God, then it would be. And so I remember seeing that moment going like, I think this is the stupidest idea I've ever heard. It's just a reason for people try to make sense of their suffering. Or to think that there's a purpose in everything that's going on. I remember getting so fed up, and for 3 or 4 months, I spent a lot of time trying to ask myself what to do. And in the book, I tell the story not like that, but of being in a place where if you're a philosophy major and you've like postmodern like a champ, you've deconstructed everything. You're like Derrida's for wussies. I can outdo that junk. Then I remember getting at a point where I was like, yeah, all these meta-narratives are just oppressive. This is blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, well, I should at least arbitrarily pick one because for social science reasons, people have longer lives and more valuable relationships if they locate their narrative in a larger one that moves towards reconciliation. And when you have kids, you can't really explain them kind of Heidegger and post-Heidegger hermeneutical theory in order to deconstruct the truth regime. So I should probably pick one. And for a while, it was going to be a Taoist. I think I kind of like half Taoist, half Christian. I don't know. Or if you can do both. But then when it got to Lent that year, in Holy Week, I reread the Passion Week story, so the last week of Jesus' life. And I have done that at Lent for a long time because a Baptist preacher's kid who starts churches, you out-Bible people like a champ in order to demonstrate your holiness, because nothing says the love of Jesus like being able to shame other people for not having as much Bible knowledge as you, obviously. So I was rereading it and like, oh my God, I guess I should do it because I don't want to like not do it because I've always done it, blah, 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 blah. And then it gets to the scene on the cross in the Gospel of Luke. And Jesus prays, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And I thought that is one of the most beautiful statements I've ever heard. Like, he is in a giant cluster curse of a situation. Feels abandoned by God. The only person that are even paying attention are the people nailing up next to him. He knows he's not there that he's suffering innocently and all these types of things. And his response is forgive them. And it's because they don't know what they do. And I thought, I have a strong confidence that human beings have no idea why we do most of what we do. And a lot of what we do that we think we have reasons for, we put some agenda on it. Freedom, liberty, nation, family, or whatever. And then we end up crucifying people all over the place. But if there was going to be something true, and I was to arbitrarily pick a meta-narrative, I was going to pick the one where Jesus says, forgive them, Father, for I know not what they do. And I wasn't even sure there was a father there. Or if the retention of the word father didn't instantiate patriarchy and hierarchy into the Christian narrative. But I say that to go from that moment of going, I don't even know if I believe in God or any of this, but I think I like the meta-narrative of a dude that loved their enemies so much that posited the idea of God on the cross for one thing, forgiving them and recognizing that we are also connected to a sick system that we kill innocent people. And that if you're going to figure out your life, your meaning, purpose, value, what you do vocationally, that's a beautiful story to tell. And now I say more than that in the book, but thinking back to being an undergrad and that experience, this book really began there, where I decided that the aesthetics of that moment compelled me to keep wrestling with the story of Jesus, even if I wasn't sure about God, the church, Christianity, or whatever.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Just a couple days ago, some folks in our ministry group out here were actually talking about like, how can we do the Eucharist? How can we do communion? We have a bunch of different backgrounds from different high and low Christian traditions. So what do you think is, like, what is it that we need to bring to the table, and what is it that for undergrads in a student ministry, what can we be tempted to bring to our ministry that we really should drop and leave aside? Paul talks about a couple things, but what for you as a campus minister do you think is important?
Well, I think that if I was in charge of a denomination and we're deciding how to invest the time and energy and funds for a denomination, it would be invested in the leaders of college ministry groups, because where we have permission to be creative, try something, and then y'all know every year you're like, I like my student group, and a fourth of them left, you have a new group, and you're a new thing every year. You're also with people who have yet to get so much debt and pressure from the world that the only options of living out your faith are ones where you're rigged into the system. By the time y'all finish grad school and have a stack of student loans, and you get in your positions, the things you have to do to pay off those student loans will limit your possibility of faithfulness. And so I just think it's important to see that, one, those relationships in a student ministry group are essential for the future of the church. And if you learn as college students to make space for more doubts, more questions, greater activism at the centerpiece of the church, and venturing honesty past a prayer of confession. Christians today, some of them cut out the prayer of confession out of worship. And if there's one thing you know about everyone that you hang out with in your college group, is by the end of your 4 years, you will know 2 of their worst moments of their life. Like, I'm not going to tell stories on the internet, but I was a campus minister and knew very poor life decisions, plenty of them made.
Right.
And those situations become what? Opportunities where those friendships and bond are more important than breaking some holiness code, fracturing a relationship and stuff. The other things you end up sharing are the moments where you make decisions that impact the rest of your life. And you get to figure out as a community, how do those decisions knit into the bigger story that the church is telling? Where we decide to work, our vocations, what we decide to learn, and all those things should be connected, not just to means of paying your bills and donating to your church and nonprofits or whatever. They should be donated to you. They should be connected to you living out your faith deeply. And so when I start to think of Eucharist and those in communion and things in those settings, half the time we have problems is because, okay, I know the denominations don't like to hear this. Most college students, even if they love the church they came from, are not there because that's their brand, right? Like, brand loyalty for denominations only matters to the people who stay in that denomination long enough to be called bishop. Like, even the elders might not care. And so when I was in campus ministry, we had a building at UNC Greensboro that had like all the religions and all the denominations ministers in it. And we were always trying to figure out how can we work and do stuff together and then make the hierarchy happy for our team. And so like we had a whole series of non-publicized reading groups and prayer groups and activist groups because we wanted people from all the groups to get to be a part of them. So like I would say, figure out how the leadership can make the right people happy. But the main activity when you're gathering is like, how do you create the relationships and the experience in which when you come to the table, you're coming having been open and honest to yourself and to each other. And one of the coolest things we did, and this is because I was in Winston-Salem and Moravians are all over the place. Moravians have this thing called a love feast, which they borrow from the early church, but it's sweet. It's like communion with sweetbread and coffee. Well, but there's no liturgical rules on how you can participate in love feasts and things. And every college student needs coffee to stay awake. So we started doing ecumenical love feasts. And we would like each group would make some really nice hot sweetbread, and everyone knows, like, if you show up at this time, like during study week, you get lots of sweetbread, and on the outside of the door it said absolutely no discussion of your exams, your finals, and your papers. When you walk in, you will turn off your phones. And this is early days. This is before social media. I don't know if I could turn it off now, but everyone set their phones down when they walked in the door. And we had live music. We had a massage chairs all set up, and you had like homemade cinnamon rolls and coffee, and you hung out for an hour, and then someone got up at the end and just said, in the middle of all you're doing, I want to remind you, some of this matters for what you do later in your life. But what matters was probably the people that you have connected with, shared life with, and are going forward. And on occasion, you might use your exam material. And it was this love feast that was just a protest to our entire lives being determined by what? A university that's like, we have to meet these things so they can get these jobs, they can be successful these ways, and here's how we assess it. Here we got evaluated. So what was the love feast? No phones. No talking of any of this. You're going to have to do something so revolutionary. Hang out with the people around you and have homemade cinnamon rolls and drink coffee. And if you can do that for an hour during exam week, then Christ was there. And you can imagine a cool sermon where you're breaking the script of economism and all that kind of stuff. We don't have to go into that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's fun. In most churches, when you try to do this stuff, they look at you like, now here's how we've always done this. And you're like, yeah, well, how's that worked out?
Yeah, absolutely. Just quick note out here for anyone in the room with me. If you have any questions, just feel free to raise your hand and we'll get you up on the stream just to ask Tripp. But Tripp, I have another question for you that you quote Kierkegaard early on in your book. And the Kierkegaard quote includes faith as the possibility of being offended. So what about Jesus ought to be offensive and compelling to us college undergrads? How should we be offended? In what ways do we forget just the offensiveness of Jesus?
Oh, I mean, that's a great question. And I think Kierkegaard is built for campus ministry, because being an existential. Okay, so when I was a campus minister, you know how there are certain movies that at a college, and it's not even all the same at every college, but a college, like in a dorm, on my hall, there were 14 copies of I Heart Huckabees and Dogma. I mean, I'm dating myself, but there's certain movies everyone had, and they were like the background noise of dorm rooms. I'm sure now they're related to Netflix, but this was back when we had to. This was like Napster days. I don't know if y'all have heard of this. You had really slow internet, and you left your computer on all day. And then when someone came in and said, have you ever heard this? And you have on your computer like 20,000 songs. People are like, oh, how'd you do that? And then they started blocking you from doing it. But one of the conversations that always came up when I in campus ministry and when I was in college are those questions about recognizing your finitude. You start to realize that when you're not with your parents and your friends that are all in the place you grew up, that half of what they told you is BS. And the only reason they said it is because they all say it. And then they're like, well, you know what they say. You know who they is? It's everybody and nobody. And then you're in a college, and you have people that are from more places in the world, and you're meeting professors that are challenging you here, different religions, different faiths, different part of the country, and all of a sudden you realize that half of what you thought was essential to who you were in the world in reality is BS. It might still be true, but you're going to have to work that out, because guess what you don't get to do? Just be like, well, you know what they say, and then homeboy next to you is like, they don't say that where I live, and it just happens. Like even in the South, it happens. So Kierkegaard, the offense is built for calling BS. So Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher, And it was at a time in Denmark where everyone is Christian. They had a state church. You became a citizen and a Christian at the same time at your baby baptism, because we know what all babies think. They love Jesus. And Kierkegaard is just like angry. He's like, if everyone's a Christian, then no one's a Christian. And if you've ever read the New Testament, there ain't nothing logical about it. So, like, at the heart of Christianity is this affirmation that God was in Christ, reconciling the world to God's self. That God was made flesh, this incarnation thing. And Kierkegaard, like, it wants to sit there and just pause for a second with an entire country who believes this and go, so, a homeless first century Jew who was executed by the political powers that be and went around with his other underemployed dudes and was funded by a few rich women, and collected the outcasts from society, is the firstborn of all creation, the image of the invisible God, and was the infinite made flesh. And this is what everyone believes?
Yeah, let me say professors here find that a very obvious claim. Very obvious.
Oh, that's true?
Oh, yeah. No, I'm being facetious.
Oh.
Why do we
I mean, so Kierkegaard's going like, this is nuts. Now, his they were Christians. It was a bunch of conservative Christians. They were so conservative, they were preserving the power and regime of the state and the church together and never noticing that Jesus was stinking crazy. He was challenging people. He was offensive. He was pushing people. Like, Jesus's main topics are caring for others, forgiving without counting, not seeking after money. There are only two people he got even pissed at, which are not the two that tends to people of privilege get pissed at: rich people that don't sacrifice for others, and religiously pretentious people. Those are the only ones where he pulls out the, like, look, if there's a hell, you should go there card. It is not because some, like, a little middle school boy is, like, surfing the internet for titty pics. That's not what Jesus was all hung up about. So what Kierkegaard, the offense, when Jesus says, blessed are those who don't take offense at me, he's saying, if you know what it is I'm offering, you should be offended, and you only don't take offense because you get it. The response that Jesus is evoking, like, Kierkegaard draws a contrast between, like, the Buddha and Jesus, and to say that they have very different vocations and different identities, or Socrates or a teacher. A teacher of wisdom succeeds when they're no longer necessary, and now you've learned it, and now you can transfer that learning to others. But Jesus was not that way. What you realize in your encounter with Christ is that God coming to us, disturbing us, shaking us, giving us ourselves back differently, was necessary. Not an idea that we finally gain, but it was that disturbing, reconciling event that was necessary. And for that, it always has a referent that's Jesus. And so the offense, why I find that helpful for me, is because the other temptation is to figure out how to either argue with every professor that has a critique to justify something about Jesus, which is a hobby of mine. So I'm not against doing it. Has anyone ever read a book about belief in God, either for or against it, and got done and said, well, I guess I'm changing my mind? No. You want to know who buys the book? People that already agree with it. And they might get more sophisticated in what they think. A friend of mine is doing a PhD on using kind of religious community socio analysis on new atheist equivalent of churches in LA. Odd thing. Fundamentalist Christians and members of the new atheist church in LA have equal scientific comprehension. Like, if you actually have to make them answer questions about science, it's like they were all humanities majors. And you may be saying, oh, how is that possible? Well, guess what? Most people don't believe things because they actually know how it really works. And yet, this is professors' faults. I'm sure it is, because you got Christian ones that are like showing you those stupid movies with Rambo or what's his name, the dude that played Hercules. What's that movie called? You know, the one where he's the philosophy professor. Oh, geez. There's a second one that came out. God's not dead. Yeah. Hercules is the philosophy professor, and he's like doing these atheist arguments, and then there's like the kid who's getting persecuted but prays and comes up with philosophical proofs. Then Hercules is about to die, and he's like, I guess I should have told God sorry. Like, there's a reason those movies happen and people feel good going to them, but it's not because that philosophy class made anyone change their mind. Philosophy helps you ask better questions and think about it. But the reason you respond in a way that Kierkegaard's wanting, like this, to give yourself completely to something, is more akin to falling in love than the end of a mathematical syllogism. Like, I could try to explain to you when I fell in love with my wife. We met when we were 18. I could tell you stories. We were freshmen in college, and we started hanging out, and I was going to pretend I knew French so I could hang out with her, and that was quickly discovered. So I was like, let's talk about your history class. And then I tried to be nice to everyone I knew that lived on her hall so that when she background checked me, she would say yes to going out. And then, like, I remember, young love. I remember first kiss. I remember the first time I thought I was going to break up with her, and then I realized I was pissed because I didn't want to say I was sorry. And I've still learned that lesson over and over since. I could tell all that. But at no point, if I told my entire love story, is Jesse going to go, well, I guess I want to marry your wife too. That's not even the proper response. The reason you give yourself to someone, you can give an account of it. You can be like, here's a story, here's a fact, here's a relationship, blah, blah, blah. But at no point is that encounter transferable. And Jesse could tell me a story, and I'd be like, that was a beautiful love story. And I don't go, what's the number? You know, so that is what Kierkegaard's trying to say, is that a response of faith, this leap of faith, the offense is that God in Christ is offering you God's self. That's offensive and ridiculous. And if you know it's offensive when you realize what it is you're saying. But Kierkegaard thought that if God is genuinely loving and wants a loving relationship with humanity, it's impossible for God to do that coercively, right? Like, you can't walk up to someone and be like, you shall be my partner, we shall make love. They're like, that's called rape. You can't force someone to do that. If God just shows up, it's like, what's up, peeps? You want to hang out in heaven? Or, whatever. I don't know how God would show up and say something. But like, I'm God, I love you. You don't really get a genuine response. And so he tells a story about a king and a maiden, and this king falls in love with a maiden, like people do in King Arthur time. I don't know. But if he wants to actually know the maiden and get a genuine response, he ditches the crown and goes and works to get calluses, and then gets in a position where he gets a job working with her. And then they meet and they fall in love. And then it's only in that point when he says, I love you. Will you marry me? And she says, yes, I love you too. And he says, all that's mine is yours, and all that's yours is mine. Oh, yes, because the love is genuine. Is in that moment when she discovers, this is the king, then the love is genuine, and the perks can be actualized without coercion. And so Kierkegaard thought of that kind of parable, and the incarnation, the offensive part, is that in Christ we come to know that God knows us completely, loves us completely. And that is not something you can learn directly. God has to communicate it indirectly without having this coercion that violates kind of the basic necessity of love. And that's actually why I think we, like, even when I was talking about the Eucharist, or we had, got masseuses in and had a love feast and all that kind of stuff, is it that tending to the quality of relationships and the support you can provide each other, and experiences where you re-engage with the fullness of your humanity in different ways. Sometimes we did a lot of hiking trips because we had the Appalachian Trail nearby and stuff. They're all different ways, but when you're in college, ways in which you occupy space and relationships that are not scripted by your parents, your tribe, your culture, your future employment, and stuff like that, in a place where you get to, I mean, some professions it stays true, but in college is one of the places you actually interact with a huge spectrum of difference that you won't have once you hang out at a job. Because you know what, who works at your job? Everyone who made all the same compromises to get that job. That's who works there. And so this is the moment as an adult where you actually get the chance to build friendships that you don't get the rest of the time. You have to work hard, real hard as an adult. It's real depressing.
Yeah, I want to ask you a question that's kind of a follow-up to that in terms of just obviously the great diversity of people in college. Kierkegaard as like faith as a reaction as falling in love. One of the things that for me is difficult is you quickly come to realize spending time in Christian community, just how differently people respond. Like me to my roommate, to my best friend, to my dad, you know, we all are reacting and responding to this call in different ways. But sometimes it's really difficult to not just affirm their response, but even like affirm your own in relationship to theirs. So yeah, what do you have to say about that kind of dynamic, that struggle in, 20-year-olds studying, philosophy, religion, etc., coming from different backgrounds, that different response?
Well, I mean, I like to think two things. One is just a truism that I think is always helpful. You are not your ideas. The people in your family are not their ideas. The people in your faith community or former faith community are not their ideas. People in your campus ministry group are not their ideas. The super annoying libertarian economics professor who is a young earth creationist but won't tell anyone because he has a blog where you're just like, oh my goodness, who gave you a PhD? Is not his ideas. I mean, I still am a little bitter about this. But recognizing that you're not your ideas is, I think, important because you have the ability then to be honest about them, let others be honest, and then you have the ability to change your mind because guess what? You're going to. And a lot of times there's a struggle, especially as you start to think through things, to process stuff. Some people's identity of faith is so rigid that the idea that you're asking questions is a threat to theirs. Now, I mean, we could talk about why that is, but when you recognize that, just know you decide how much pain that relationship is worth going to those places. If it's some family members, I'm comfortable working it through, talking long, trying to talk in a way they understand me, all that. But others, I found out that if you just don't talk about it, you can, on Thanksgiving, get done with the meal, smoke a cigar, and just argue about politics because deep down they're a Calvinist. And I can't stand that. Or, you know what I mean? So, like, one, if you're not your ideas, you get permission to have relationships that are not about getting someone to think something. Because the other side is, when you're not distracted by them, there are people in your life who are idiots who live more beautiful lives than you. Smart people overthink everything. We have a hard time, if you're a nerd, like getting to living things out well. And then if you do, it's selective. You're like, well, this one issue that I'm really informed on, I have high integrity in the way I live mostly, but I don't, at least the parts I tell people about on the internet. And then there's like all the other parts. But some of the most beautiful people, if you ask them why they did it, you don't even want to listen, but they're high quality. So differentiating a person from their ideas is helpful. And the best way of doing it is coming up with a way where each instantiation of yourself still fits in your story. If you go back and think of what in the world would you be thinking of little middle school version of yourself who's sitting there, their first day in Bible class at church and blowing smoke about whatever it was you were blowing smoke about, and then you change your mind. In high school, I had like 17 different things I was into. Every couple of months, you get a new wardrobe, a new ideology. And then, I mean, I had a period at the end of high school going into undergrad, before I just quit everything, I got really into being a Calvinist. I can't stand them. I mean, like, that's the worst idea. I'd rather be an atheist than a Calvinist. Horrible. Their God's not even, I don't even know how you can worship. Anyway, but I was that person. So if you can figure out how to understand your faith, where all the previous versions of you and the future ones are still a part of that story, and you have grace for yourself at each moment, because at every moment you thought the previous ones were wrong and you finally arrived, and then you're going to do the same again later. Then you can start to do the same for other people. Because if they're not their ideas, you aren't yours, and you have grace for every part of your journey, then you can start to do the same for others. And then you talk about it, and you're not anxious. Because the problem, I think, with conversations around big things is we get anxious about it. And why we get anxious, it's important to know, because college students, when you go home and your parents ask you about the election, reading your Bible, or whatever the questions are that are going to lead to conflict, that's the questions they're asking out loud. But the question they want to know is, did I fail at being your parent? Is there something to our relationship you would choose to love and cherish if you didn't have to? And is there something you still think you learned from me? Now, parents don't know that's how they're asked. They're freaking out. They're like, I saw that you hit like on this book on Good Books, and he is a Marxist. And that means, Marx was an atheist and a Jew. Neither one of them have Jesus in their heart, son. Like, there could be whatever it is. I saw you went to like 2 rated R movies. I mean, I know you're 18, but that doesn't mean you don't want to. There could be all sorts of things. They're like, you were burned to your bust? Trump's your fault, son. Be pragmatic. Like, there could be all sorts of things. But remember, when you are engaging your faith community, your friends that you had before college, your family and stuff, whatever they say the issue is rarely the issue. And the reason all the anxiety and energy comes up isn't because they think what you think about X, Y, and Z is ultimately important. They're asking a question about the value and worth of what they contributed to their life and that kind of thing. So when I was a campus minister, everyone's freaking out when you're going back for Thanksgiving, especially during election years, because stuff happened since the last time you were home. And on Thursday nights, we would write 2 weeks out a letter to whichever parent that you're going to see that you're most worried about. And all it was, hey, we're not really here on Thanksgiving because we come back. So we had our Thanksgiving service early. And what we did was we wrote a letter to tell someone we love, thank you for ways they blessed us. And so I wanted to tell you. And then you tell mom or dad or whatever, all that. When you go home, if the beginning of that conversation is a parent who spent the time not dwelling on your Facebook posts they're concerned about, but a letter you wrote with your hand that said, Mom, I want you to know, I know you're probably worried because we cancel each other's vote out or whatever, but I just hope that I'm never a person that cancels out, having learned the kind of attentive love you gave me. I can't believe you tolerated me from basically 13 till today. I know it, blah, 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 blah. You said this. I want that to be a part of my life. And, I don't even know it. Like, I'm sure there are lots of things we could get into arguments about, but I just want you to know that I'm going to be praying for you every night, and I know you do it for me, even if I'm not sure anyone listens. But you do. And then in parentheses, like I heart JC or whatever. Like, little things like that shift it. And part of it is just being attentive to the difference between being present to people and their stories and their concerns and their anxieties and stuff we carry, and letting ideas dominate our relationships. If your theology doesn't lead you to live more loving in loving ways towards the people around you, and the people that gave you life, then that's kind of depressing. And I know as a campus minister, I'd regularly get someone, especially like the first time you find something out. I mean, this is North Carolina, so it's probably different in Columbia. But when you have a student, find out all sorts of environmental things that are going on they didn't know about, they can revolutionize very quickly. And Daddy with a hog farm is not happy. So that could come in. Or I, being at UNC, I had lots of students who were in very rural areas come, and I was the first person they came out to. And they came out to me wanting to know whether or not God thought they were lovable because of crap their parents and pastor said. And I thought, oh my God, they got to go home to that. And so, but, being able to shift the terms is something that surprisingly college students have to be the mature one to do it. And the reason isn't because your parents hate you or are freaking out. It's because they actually want to know if they did a good job. It's so interesting to think of your parents as finite, failing beings. Like we learn that from like when we were kids, and we start like doubt their abilities. Then we start to question them. We're like, this just sucks. But once you leave home, there's a whole nother layer of going through that process again. And then you realize they need something from me more than I need something from them. They're sitting there going, did I suck? And I got to figure out the one or two things right now I know they didn't suck on. And I'll go ahead and give you a heads up. Later in life, like 25 to 28, if you luck out, you'll decide to just love your parents and think they did the best they could, and now we're moving on. Because that's about the time you start thinking about being a parent, and then you realize you're going to screw your kid up, and there ain't nothing you can do about it. Like I like to tell Elgin, my son, I say, Elgin, I want you to know I worked real hard that you had less things to work out in therapy than I did. But once you start to see the pattern, it's so much easier to like see the relationships not as battles over ideas, because you're going to switch yours later and they can switch theirs, or they might hold rigidly to it for a stupid reason because of something their parents did they never told you about. Anyway, sorry that you really should just cut me off. I'll start going. And
no, that's great. So as a Bible nerd, here's the toss-up question for you. Where do you see Jesus transcending the idea that we are our ideas?
Where does Jesus do it?
Yeah, where does Jesus do that? Or what's your favorite place where Jesus does that?
Oh, I mean, so this week in the liturgical calendar, we're in the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount, if you read through it, is a horrible theology because it actually doesn't say much. But it does tell you who you are as a disciple. So the disciples come up on the mount with Jesus and he talks to them. And how does he begin? Blessed are. All the blessings are inverting the blessings of our common kind of dominant understanding of culture and power and privilege. He undoes those, and then he says, you are light of the world. You are salt of the earth. And in these type of, the entire Sermon on the Mount is an invitation to a different way of being, a community with a very different ethic. And one of the things I can't remember if it's in the book or not, but when I teach confirmation, which is, if you aren't in one of those traditions, usually like high school, you spend a year in like a small group where you kind of go through the faith, thinking about it, practicing different spiritual practices, and decide, like, that's the rite of passage of becoming an adult member in the congregation. And we would read on the opening retreat the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, which is in Luke, depending on which is the liturgical gospel for the year. Which, never mind. The church has a cycle over 3 years how you read most of the Bible. And each year a different gospel gets featured. And so we would read the gospel for your confirmation year, whichever one's that year. Anyway, so we're at confirmation retreat, and I get them to read the big discourse to the disciples in the gospel, and then say, we'll get back from this. Your parents all think you have to do this. If you don't want to try, to be a Christian and try out, like, all we're going to do for a year is do experiments in truth. We're going to do experiments like, if you believed it, which I don't know if you want to, you don't have to decide till the end of the year. We're just going to act and do all the junk Jesus says to do, and then we'll find out if it's something worth giving your life to. But if you don't even want to do that, let me know. I'll tell your parents that it's immoral for them to make you do this. But if you do, we're going to do one starting next week for the next 40 days based on something y'all pick out of here. So the first time I did it, we read the Sermon on the Mount, and they're like, what is this pray for your enemies thing, And so this is right after, I was like 2004 or so. So like post 9/11, we're invading Afghanistan. We're going to do the first experiments praying for your enemies. And I'm like, well, Jesus said to do it. One guy's like, I don't want to pray for my enemies. That means this is the South. I got to pray for Osama bin Laden. And if I saw Osama bin Laden, I'd shoot him right in his face. And I was like, well, that was awkward. Well, luckily Jesus doesn't say you have to love him. Just says you got to pray for him here. So let's do that. We're going to spend the month praying for Osama bin Laden. They wrote a nice prayer. It also included, after I prayed for him or whatever, I might want to shoot him. I'm like, I don't care. Jesus said do it. Let's figure out how it goes. They also wrote prayers for personal enemies and all kinds of things. But nonetheless, so we spend 40 days doing the praying for your enemies, and then it becomes kind of normal. Well, the odd thing is, like when Jesus asks you to do all these stuff, when you start praying for your enemies every day, you see them differently. And the prayers changed over the course of the 40 days. From, I want to pray for Osama bin Laden because Jesus said pray for your enemies, I want to shoot him in the head. By the end of the whole confirmation thing, during the service of confirmation, they do different things to like tell the story of the year and stuff. This is a 17-year-old who comes in dressed like Mr. Rogers, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Love Your Neighbor, with a cardboard cutout of Osama bin Laden. And he proceeds to give the invitation to the communion table during the worship service as Mr. Rogers with cardboard cutout Osama bin Laden. And he gives, as a redneck who's looking forward to being an Army Ranger and shoot him in the head, one of the most beautiful calls to the table I'd ever heard. Because he said, on the night in which Jesus was betrayed, and I don't know if you all know this, betrayed means one of his own people went and turned him in and got him killed. And then the other guy who's supposed to be in charge goes and tells them they don't even know who he is. He's like, that night, that's when Jesus is trying to say everybody's welcome at his table. Your neighbor and your enemy who's been running around said you're supposed to pray for and love them. And the crazy thing is, on that night, he said, this is my body, and this is my blood. And then handed the man who's about to turn him in to get him killed the gift of salvation. No, I'm not telling you at the end of the service I wouldn't walk outside and put Osama bin Laden in the ground. But I will tell you that as a follower of Christ, you'd have to offer him communion first. Now, in the South, in a church where every family has at least one military member in the thing, they looked at him like, what the hell just came out of your mouth? What did was, he just did what Jesus said, and his ideas changed. And Jesus wasn't running around going, your theology sucks. He just like, hey, why don't you pray for your enemies and those that persecute you, and then decide how God would treat them? And so, to me, not being your ideas is really a way of turning as a Christian towards the practices that Jesus taught his disciples to do. If you pray for your enemies, it's hard to imagine that the big story Scripture tells is not God reconciling with God's own enemies, but roasting 2/3 of conscious beings in eternity for forever. Like it switches. When you forgive without counting, it changes your first response when you feel violated. And we did a whole bunch of those different experiments. And funny thing is, like over the course of confirmation, every week I pretended I was going to answer theology questions. And so we had a big bowl of God questions, and they all had to come with one good one every week and put it in. And I would always run over and never answer them. And then at the end of it, I would start pulling them out and say, "Is anyone still want to ask this?" And almost no one did. And there wasn't because I answered them, though personally, as a professional theologian, I have no problem lecturing about theology for extended periods of time. It was just as Christians, when you build a community that does together these radical challenges Jesus gave his own people, more beautiful ideas are brought into being. But they're brought into being by forgiving each other, by caring for the least of these, by celebrating life against the dominant narratives that are pushed upon you and stuff like that. So, I know that was a long answer to the question, but I would just say, like, Jesus regularly taught us how to differentiate people from their ideas, because he thought ideas were so secondary. And like the few people that get ideas right in the scriptures are demons most of the time. Demons, they're like, "Oh, Son of God here. What's this going on?" He's like, "Be quiet." Peter gets it right and then gets it so wrong, he gets told he's Satan. Anyway, I don't want to start.
Great, thank you. All right, I think we're going to invite one of our guests who's out here in a classroom with us to ask you a question.
So my name's Sinai, and so my question is kind of like, how do I talk about Jesus to my friends? Because like this semester in Bible study, we're like doing the Acts of the Apostles, and it's like, we have to like be Jesus, and it's like, I don't want to like, should I just bring up Jesus casually, just like, hello? Because these are my friends and I want them to know Jesus, but like at the same time, it's like I don't want to force anything on them. So it's like, how do I find a balance between that?
Oh, you said your name's Sinai? Mm-hmm. Where are you from?
The Bronx, New York.
Oh, cool. Well, I think that's a really good question, and I think it's easy for us to know which ways we wouldn't want it shared with us. And part of, I think, being someone's friend is doing it in a way that they ever care why it is you're the friend that is a friend that way. So, when it goes to sharing faith in friendships, I think the beginning point is recognizing that your friendship is not a means to an end to get them to like sign up for Team Jesus. That you love them, care for them, want to be their friend because they actually add value to your life. Now, as a person of faith, I think that you can recognize that that any time we have relationships and friendships that bless us in our life, that is a gift not just from them but from God. And I think that's a pretty natural way to talk about it. I have a friend of mine who's very famous atheist, and I regularly tell him, I was like, well, when I talk to the flying spaghetti monster in the sky, I'll tell him that I'm extremely grateful for our friendship, and I will make jokes like that, because the other part of it is, how do you respect where they are, not to really force things on it. But the doubt or hesitation in a lot of friendships, especially when they know that faith is an important part, is that sense that you see them as like that friendship is a means to get them evangelized. So making that clear. But the other part you can make clear in that is say to a friend, especially when they need it, to say, look, you can name to them what their friendship means to you. And you can do so in ways where you say, like, I'm extremely grateful for you. I told God, thank you for you. I'm this, like this. When I was in college, I started a practice of the people that mattered most to me, having certain days of the week where I prayed for them, but mostly being grateful for them. And obviously, if something's going on in their life, then I would pray for it or whatever. But my friends, Christian, non-Christian, or whatever the like, if as we became friends, knew what day was their day. And so, like, if you and I are friends, we're talking about it, and you're like, I just, I got to decide. I'm declaring a major, and I'm really excited about this. My parents want me to do this, but then I'm like, how do you even going to get a job with this? And blah, 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 blah. You're like, anytime you need someone to listen, I'll be there. Because I'm a bit on the Jesus-y side, every Tuesday morning, I'm going to pray for you. Over time, my friends knew what day they were. All the way down to, like, one of my best friends last year who from high school called on Thursday because he knew he was Thursday, and he still was Thursday. We hadn't talked in 9 months. And he said, Tripp, he's Jewish, so he likes to say I'm his second favorite Jew. Tripp, this is your second favorite Jew is Thursday, so I know you were going to talk to Jesus about me, but can I talk to you? And so I think coming up with a natural way for you to let them know their friendship is a net gain for you. It blesses you. It's unrelated to anything religious. And one of the ways in which you describe your gratitude for people is out of your faith story. When you're able to figure out how to do that, then it's not a means to an end thing. And you would be surprised how many people, when they know that you're present to them in that way, when the time comes that they need someone, trust that more than someone who hasn't said, yeah, our relationship matters to me in a way that I am grateful to God for you. That does, like, a lot of people don't hear that from people very often, even religious people, because what do they hear from religious people? I was talking to God about what you need, and it's Jesus. And I love you, I like hanging out with you, but I'm not going to hell, so how's this going to go? Like, so those two sides of it are extremely important. The other element you can do for friendships, especially in college, is I think strategic gifting, mementos and things. Because if you're like got friends in college, you never know when the thing pops up where you're like, I'm thinking of them for this purpose. But if you give someone a cool gift, not like for their birthday or whatever, or like you're like, oh, this is the coolest song of all time. So you go on iTunes and you gift them the 99 cents thing. And then the little message thing, you're like, this is clearly your jam. Because when I think of you, I think of the person that plugs in the joy on the most boring days of all time in my life. And so I was hollering at you and told JC thanks, or something like that. There are lots of little ways where you let people know the value of their friendship to you, and that you experience that friendship as not just from them, but from God. No one takes that. I don't think I've never had anyone, even my very atheist friends, be like freaked out that Tripp, their Christian minister friend, is grateful to God for their presence. But that type of connection sets up them being able to respond if they want to, but in like a non-threatening way. I don't know that you're sitting there smiling and I start rambling and
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tripp. I don't know if we have many more questions over on this end, but I was thinking it would be fun to have you end on what I thought was one of the most interesting parts of your book, which I had never heard about growing up in the church. And you kind of gestured at it a little bit in talking about the Sermon on the Mount and this perhaps the same Sermon on the Plain. But you discuss in your book a lot about the kind of multiple perspectives, the theological diversity in the gospel text. And this guy from the 2nd century, I think, Tatian, and this heresy of harmonizing the gospels. You want to just fill us in a little bit on that, and why could that be important for the church today, and especially really academically minded people in reading the Bible?
Yeah. So Tatian was like, I think, a lot of Christians who read the Bible. If you read it, you discover that it's really hard to line up the Gospels. When I was in 4th or 5th grade was the first time I did the reading all the Passion Week things, during Lent, and I charted it out on a big piece of paper, and it was Holy Week, night before Easter, and I'm like, Mom, Dad, I have a question. My Bible's broken. They're like, what are you talking about? We gave you a real one. Like, no. After some investigation, Jesus is killed on different days in Matthew, Mark, and Luke than in John. I don't know if y'all noticed this before, but that's what my Bible says. Also, have you noticed different people see Jesus resurrected first and in different cities? And Mark, it's just like go to Galilee. That's where you see him. Never know if you see him or not. The others, different places. John, altogether different. Some of them he goes through walls. Other ones he eats. One time they think he's a gardener. The next time it wasn't Jesus. It was an angel. I start like listing them out. And my dad's like, your Bible's not broken, Trip. That's how it is. I'm like, well, then someone needed an editor because this is basic material. If you're trying to tell the truth, you should have it line up. And you come to find out, like Tatian in the early church was someone that did that. He created the first, it's called Harmony Gospel. And that's one where you take everything in all the Gospels and make it happen. So like he gives a sermon on the plain, which he gives in Luke, and then the other version that he gives on a mountain in Matthew. And it's just like they're two different sermons. They're just right there. In the Gospel of John, Jesus cleanses the temple at the beginning of his ministry. And so that's in Tatian's at the beginning. But he also cleanses it again at the end, this time without whipping anybody like he does in John's, because he does that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Lots of little things where you're like, wasn't he just on this boat saying something similar? You're like, yeah, because he did it twice. That's how you get it all to line up. So Tatian harmonized it in order so the Gospels, the surface of the Gospels were perfectly clean and lined up. And then you could go, and it got super popular. That's why they had to call a church council, that this harmonized gospel where you could be like, yeah, I see the truth. It all lines up, is on the surface. And he got condemned as a heretic. And then the church canonizes, which like the ones we get in the Bible, canonizes does sound slightly violent, but no one got shot. Canonizes the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they've read them. These are like the early church fathers when they do this. They've read them. They know they don't line up. And they're like, no basket, Tatian's a heretic, and these are the 4 Gospels. And I thought, to me, that is one of the coolest things ever. Because if you start reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have some things in common, but they significantly disagree on all sorts of things. And then you add John in the mix, and John just got crazy. He's even crazier, different than all the other 3. They don't have a lot in common. But the church said, well, these 4 Gospels are a living witness to the presence of Christ in the community. And they canonize a diversity of voices. Well, what's cool about it is that now in New Testament studies, they have a thing called redaction criticism. This is like the way you study the differences in them and where they came from and stuff to know what the agenda and ideas are that are driving an individual author. So like Mark, it's almost 2/3 of the gospel is the Passion Week. There's no birth narrative at all. It's just like, here's the gospel of Jesus, baptism, ministry, not a lot of teaching. It's just random things about the kingdom of God with intensity. And it all goes down to the throwdown. And in Mark, all you get is like, my God, why have you forsaken me? On the cross, it's shorter, compact. And it ends not with a resurrection, but with the women going to the tomb, meeting an angel, and then they go away. It said they were scared and didn't tell anyone. Now, obviously they did because it got written down, and that's kind of funny. But that's a very different ending than if you go to John, who has a very different Christology that begins with what? Not even a virgin conception, which it says nothing about in John or Mark, and Paul. No one else knew about this but Matthew and Luke. Begins with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. And then in the Gospel of John, Jesus is rocking around going like, I am this, I am that, which if everyone knows the Hebrew Bible, I am's like God's first name. So when you get to the Passion Week in John, they go to arrest Jesus, and they're like, where's Jesus? And being the walking eternal Word of God, he goes, I am. And they all fall down on the ground. Not in Mark, he's sweating blood, going, God, I don't want to do this. If this is your will, I can stick through it. In John, he's just like, I'm the Word in flesh. I'm ready to do this. Are y'all ready, fellas? I am. Boom. They fall to the ground. Then he gets out. In John, he's on the cross. It is finished. Bow. And the whole Gospel of John is talking about him being lifted up, the Word of God being lifted up, and it ends on the cross with this "it is finished" line. But he's in charge the whole time. Those are two different things. Either Jesus was sweat and blood, freaking out, trying to talk Daddy into doing something different, or he was like, "I got this. I am." But the Gospel writers are both in the New Testament, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke each have their own way. And what the church did in resisting temptation is going, no, when we identify Jesus as the Christ and are as the living body of Christ, the church, we're making a confession of faith that looks and sounds different. If you're in a different community with a different experience in your life in different places. John was clearly up on his Greek philosophy, and it sounds different when he does it than apocalyptic Jewish Mark. And Luke, who is way too Gentile friendly for Matthew, they have significant disagreements but strong overlap. And yet they're all in canon together. And so what you have in the canon in the New Testament is the church saying we are not going to get rid of a diversity of different ways of understanding Jesus as the Christ and articulating that faith. That in the New Testament, you have guardrails that protect a Jesus who could barely even call God out on the cross in Mark. Why have you forsaken me? And an ending that is they were scared and didn't tell anyone. To John, where he's like, I am. And then he comes back, eats fish, and tells Peter, feed my sheep 3 times. You get there, it's all there and everything in between. And what the church has done after Tatian is they secretly became Tatianites again. They took the creeds or the faith commitments of any church, and then they project them back on the Bible, and they tell Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, no, you are all insert my religious traditions beliefs. And so actually in the New Testament, there is a revolutionary text there that insists that each person's confession of faith in their own tongue, experience, articulation is to be valued. You could have a diversity of ideas, but the diversity is preserving what faith is actually about. It's not about our ideas. It's not about our conclusions. It's about narrating and animating the living and life-giving relationship we have with each other and with God, inspired, informed, and empowered by Jesus. This is very, very crazy. Prophetic Jew from the first century who causes trouble. And to be faithful when we recognize this diversity is to, again, for us to tell the stories about that confession that Jesus is the Christ for us. What does it sound like? Well, the canon has 4 different voices before there was a creed and before there was an empire that knew who Jesus was. Today, we have confessions, and we know what it sounds like when people of color that were regularly silenced by the church, women's voices, gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual friends, all sorts of people whose voices would have never been preserved are continuously harmonized by the church and said, here, say this. But the New Testament resisted it. And I think today, one of the greatest gifts we have as Christians is the ability to recognize that in celebrating, hearing, understanding, wrestling with the diversity of people who make this confession, their experience, to be blessed by this diversity and not Tatian it out. And as a campus minister for me, like that meant for me, like taking a Rush Limbaugh Calvinist person's experience seriously. Like my friends that were more progressive, or they were so, they're like super nerdy. I don't know if I believe in God. I just like justice, Jesus. Cool. I got that. I know how to do that. But Home Spice quoting Calvin at me and telling me about Adam Smith, I'm like, watch out. And so I don't say it like to give the examples and like this is just progressive agenda. No, it means that the body of Christ is hugely diverse, and we should celebrate it and protect it. And then when we recognize that we're a part of a body that is that diverse, it calls forth faithfulness to us in so many ways. Like when Jesus says, "Give us today our daily bread," and we think we're praying it not just with the people at our congregation who are deciding where to eat after church, but with the people who are starving because of desertification and climate change in Africa, or that we're praying it with people who are sitting there wondering whether or not bombs we built and sold to another country are going to hit on their homes, then we understand that the diversity and plurality of voices that are praying, "Give us today our daily bread," calls forth faithful response. And the conservative thing to do is to care about it. Not like, oh, liberal agenda. No, it's just straight up Christianity. And yet, when you Tatianize it and whitewash, might be the best way, all the differences into this layer of sameness that just so happens to turn a first-century prophetic Jew into a white upper-middle-class Republican, then you just know that you've already killed the text. And progressive people and people that are going through doubts and stuff have a good reason to be like, this is ridiculous, church. The only thing is, I think Jesus is joining them. And we're at a time where we get to figure out what the next generation of faith is going to be. We get to build friendships and community, especially as students, where you're going to figure out your vocation, your own identity and stuff, and you have a chance not to get the Tatian whitewash version of Jesus. You can do the one that decenters us from our privilege and turns us towards the other, that insists upon honesty and vulnerability in relationships, and figure out what that looks like. And that's not that is like the basic challenge of Christian faith, and it's totally cool. Like I always be excited about that. And I think that's why I call it freaking awesome, because that's the task I think Jesus calls us into. Whether or not that means you're a part of Christianity or the church as it's currently understood, I don't know. I think that's above my pay grade. But I think of when you're in a situation like so many of y'all are as students, it's a great time to take the task and challenge of that Christ gives seriously. All of us that are older will die, and it is all be alls. So, and then you'll hopefully will have kids that think you're crazy and will challenge you, or we can just figure out how to disengage from a tradition of a revolutionary, radical, first-century prophetic Jew and let capitalism tell us how to tell our stories about ourselves. Or we can just inherit the very privilege-friendly version we've already got and just keep passing it on, because at least we don't feel good about dying. We don't have to worry about dying too much anymore. Both of those, very boring for me. So I think like the whole the push of the book is to look at all the different nerdy and different ways we think about God and Jesus and history and the development of it and stuff. But it really kind of moves to a conclusion that's a pretty practical one, that recognizes that, we aren't going to stop being a believer and a skeptic. Like everyone's kind of stuck in the middle. You don't like just arrive where you're like, I'm a Christian, now I believe these things. Or someone has so eliminated hints of the transcendence and the mysterious out of their life. They're like, I know it all. And if I just had all the right math equations and knew the right things, I could explain everything. And you have this reductionistic materialism. That's not what human beings do. We're stuck in this middle position, and there's a long, nerdy reason how we got there. But I think that being a believing skeptic and a skeptical believer today means we can give ourselves, like we do to a lover, to this story, the Christ, this encounter in the community, and at the same time go, yeah, and I'm not sure exactly how it all works out. In the same way, I told my wife I do, and I had no idea what pain I was going to cause her and she was going to cause me. And I had zero idea the amount of joy that you can give each other when you're vulnerable and give yourself one to another. That, I think, is the leap of faith or the call of Christ. And when you do it that way, you can be a believer and a skeptic. But the coolest part is that you also get to be skeptical to the stories that people put upon you. That success is getting this type of privilege, or success is connected to power and influence you get or possessions you have. You can call BS on that. You can be skeptical because you have a different narrative to locate yourself, to have a community to challenge that. And so just as the skepticism can get turned because you read Sartre till early evening and think about finitude, the skepticism can also get turned to all the roles that people are ready to hand you when you get done with your Columbia degree. They're like, here's grad school, here's a career, here's a pathway, and luckily you have been groomed to be the heirs of privilege for our world right now, and obviously it's going great. So, like, I worry that too many postmodern-y, more progressive Christians spend all their time getting skeptical and doubting and thinking about ideas as if that was Jesus's priority. And they don't also turn their skepticism towards all the assumptions that keep the world exactly as it is. And so, yeah, I mean, that would be kind of my challenge, especially thinking of campus ministry. What are the ways you use Jesus to deconstruct the narratives your family gave you, your faith gave you, your culture gives you, your economics department, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Trip. I guess we'll end it right there, and I'll just say we at Columbia Faith in Action and just a couple folks out here on campus, thank you so much for video chatting in with us. And for those online and in the room, go check out Trip's podcast work at homebrewedchristianity.com or Homebrewed Christianity on Facebook, Twitter, your favorite podcast stream. And yeah, that's about it, folks. So yeah, thanks for being here.
Oh, I really enjoyed it, and I know that you just a bunch of people just got the book. So if a group manages to read it, or get around saying they read it but not actually read it, and but decide to do experiments in truth, or think about what it would be like not to be our ideas but to be a community with practices at the center and stuff, I'm always down to show back up and talk with college students and people thinking about their vocation in that time. So more power to you, and yeah, thanks for asking.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Trip.
Awesome.